What would you do if the people you were told to hate became the ones who saved your life? In the ashes of 1945 Tokyo, starving Japanese women stood face to face with British soldiers, the enemy they'd been taught to fear. What happened next shattered everything they believed about war, humanity, and the power of a simple gesture. This is not just a story about food. This is a story about the moment compassion defeated propaganda, and how a tin of corned beef became more powerful than any weapon. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because this story belongs to all of us. August 1945. The war is over, but Japan is broken. Not just its buildings, its people. Tokyo, once a city of light and movement, now breathes dust and silence. The firebombings have left entire neighborhoods as skeletal remains. But the real devastation isn't what you can see. It's what you can feel. Hunger. Not the kind you experience when you skip lunch. The kind that hollows you out. That makes mothers choose which child eats today. The kind that erases everything except survival. Into this nightmare, foreign soldiers are arriving. The British Commonwealth Occupation Force. And every Japanese citizen has been told the same thing for years. If the enemy comes, expect no mercy, expect brutality, expect punishment for a war that consumed the world. But what actually happened in those first encounters would become one of the most unexpected and deeply human moments in post-war history, a moment that would challenge everything both sides believed about each other. Among the British soldiers arriving in Tokyo was Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley, a man whose quiet presence seemed almost out of place in a military uniform. At 43, Hartley had seen the worst of the Burma campaign. The mud, the disease, the unthinkable casualties. He'd lost men under his command, watched friends die in jungles thousands of miles from home. War had every right to make him bitter, to harden him into the kind of officer who saw enemies as abstractions, as objects of conquest rather than people. But something in Hartley had remained stubbornly intact. Perhaps it was his upbringing in a small Yorkshire village where his mother ran a soup kitchen during the Depression, where he'd watched her feed anyone who knocked, regardless of their story. Perhaps it was the letters from his wife, Mary, who worked as a nurse and wrote to him about the shared humanity she saw in every wounded soldier, regardless of which side they fought for. Or perhaps it was simply that Hartley had looked into too many dying eyes to believe that nationality mattered in those final moments. He'd made a promise to himself during those darkest nights in Burma. If he survived, if he ever had the power to choose compassion over cruelty, he would. Now, standing in the ruins of Tokyo, he had that power, and he was about to use it in a way that would shock his own command, confuse his fellow soldiers, and completely upend the expectations of an entire population. The order from high command was clear: maintain distance, establish authority, ensure compliance. The occupation was to be orderly, professional, and above all, it was to reinforce that Japan had been defeated. Fraternization was discouraged. The Japanese people were to understand their place in this new reality. But on a gray afternoon in September, in the Shinbashi district where buildings leaned like broken teeth and survivors moved like ghosts, Hartley made a decision that broke protocol completely. He'd been observing a group of women, perhaps 20 of them, gathered near what used to be a market square. They weren't begging, weren't asking for anything. They simply stood there, watching the military trucks pass, their faces a mixture of fear and resignation. Their bodies betraying the truth that propaganda couldn't hide. They were starving. Their clothes hung loose, their movements were slow and careful, as if they were conserving every ounce of energy. Some held children who were too weak to cry. Hartley stopped his jeep. His driver, Private Thompson, looked at him questioningly. Without a word, Hartley walked to the supply truck following behind them and began pulling out ration boxes. Thompson's eyes widened. Another soldier started to speak. "Sir, the regulations—" Hartley cut him off with a look. Then he did something that would be talked about for decades. He picked up a box of biscuits, walked directly to the group of women, and held it out. Not as a conqueror granting favors, not with ceremony or performance, simply as one human being offering food to another who needed it. The gesture was so simple, so unexpected, that time seemed to stop. But not everyone saw it as Hartley did. Standing across the street, observing from a damaged building that now served as a temporary British command post, was Major Geoffrey Pemberton, a career officer whose entire identity was wrapped in military hierarchy and the proper order of things. Pemberton was 48, impeccably dressed even in these ruins, his mustache perfectly trimmed, his posture rigid with the certainty that had carried him through 2 decades of colonial service in India and Singapore. To Pemberton, the world made sense only when everyone knew their place. And right now, the Japanese were the defeated, the conquered, the lesson to be taught. He'd lost a brother at Singapore when the Japanese took the city, and that loss had crystallized into something cold and unforgiving in his chest. Beside him stood Captain Richard Ashford, younger but equally convinced of British superiority. A man who spoke frequently about maintaining standards and not going soft. Ashford had spent the war in intelligence, analyzing enemy communications, reducing thousands of Japanese people to abstract threats on paper. He'd never seen them as individuals, only as the enemy collective. And now there was Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, a war correspondent who'd embedded herself with the occupation force, a woman whose sharp pen had made her famous back in London for her unflinching descriptions of Japanese barbarism. She'd covered the stories of POW camps, of the Burma Railway, of the Bataan Death March, and every word she'd written had been fueled by righteous anger. Her readers expected her to show no mercy, and she'd built her reputation on giving them exactly that. These three watched Hartley's gesture with growing alarm and disgust. Pemberton's jaw tightened. Ashford shook his head slowly. Mrs. Fletcher pulled out her notebook. And from the Japanese side, there was another kind of antagonist. The internal voice of propaganda that had lived in every citizen's mind for years. The women themselves had been taught that surrender meant dishonor, that accepting help from the enemy was betrayal, that they should fear and hate these foreign soldiers. The real battle wasn't just between people. It was between the narratives they'd been fed and the reality standing before them. The silence in that ruined square was deafening. The Japanese women stared at the box in Hartley's hands as if it might explode. One of them, an older woman with gray streaks in her hair and a face carved by loss, took a half step back, bowing deeply, her body trembling. She seemed terrified, not of Hartley himself, but of what accepting this meant. Another woman whispered something in Japanese, a warning perhaps, or a prayer. A young mother clutched her child tighter, the little girl's eyes fixed on the biscuits with desperate hunger, while the mother's face showed pure conflict. Need versus fear, survival versus pride. Hartley stood there, holding the box, waiting. He didn't force it forward, didn't speak. His entire posture communicated patience, safety, choice. Behind him, his soldiers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to follow his lead or wait for orders that made more sense. That's when Pemberton's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Hartley! What in God's name do you think you're doing?" The major strode across the rubble-strewn street, Ashford and Mrs. Fletcher following closely. The Japanese women flinched at the sharp tone, moving closer together like birds sensing a predator. Hartley turned slowly, his expression calm but firm. "I'm distributing rations, Major." "You're breaking protocol," Pemberton snapped, his face reddening. "These people need to understand the order of things. You can't just—" "This isn't charity work, Lieutenant Colonel. This is an occupation. There are proper channels, proper procedures. The Japanese government is responsible for feeding their own people. We are here to maintain order, not to play the bleeding hearts." Ashford stepped forward, adding his voice to the assault. "Sir, with respect, this sends entirely the wrong message. These people need to understand consequences. They started this war. They committed atrocities. If we just hand out food like we're their friends, how do we maintain authority? How do we ensure compliance?" Mrs. Fletcher's pen was already moving across her notebook. "Lieutenant Colonel Hartley," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of performative concern that masked judgment, "I've seen what the Japanese did to our boys in those camps. I've interviewed survivors whose stories would make you weep. Are you really suggesting we should just forget all that? That we should reward them with our rations while British families back home are still on rationing themselves?" The crowd of women didn't understand the English words, but they understood the tone perfectly. Anger, condemnation, authority. Several began to back away. The young mother looked like she might cry, torn between hunger and the instinct to flee. The tension was palpable, the air thick with competing moralities. Hartley stood at the center of it all, still holding that box of biscuits. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Major Pemberton," Hartley began, his Yorkshire accent somehow making the words feel more grounded, more real. "I understand your concerns. I do. But with respect, I don't believe you understand what we're looking at here." "What we're looking at," Pemberton interrupted, "is a violation of starving human beings," Hartley continued, not raising his voice but somehow stopping Pemberton mid-sentence through sheer moral clarity. That's what we're looking at, sir. Not soldiers, not the Japanese military, not the people who made decisions in Tokyo that led to this war. We're looking at mothers and children who are dying because there's no food. And we have food. So the question isn't about protocol. The question is, what kind of men do we want to be? Ashford laughed, a short, bitter sound. Oh, that's rich. Moral philosophy in the middle of an occupation. Tell me, Lieutenant Colonel, were you thinking about what kind of men we want to be when Japanese soldiers were bayoneting prisoners? When they were starving our boys in camps? When they were... I was thinking about it every single day. Hartley cut him off, and now there was steel in his voice, a hardness that made Ashford take a step back. Every day in Burma, Captain. Every night I spent listening to men die in agony, wondering if we'd ever make it out. Every time I had to write a letter to a mother telling her that her son wasn't coming home. I thought about exactly that question. What kind of man do I want to be? And I decided I don't want to be the kind of man who sees suffering and chooses to perpetuate it because it's convenient or because I'm angry. That's not strength, Captain. That's just continuing the cycle. The observers, both the British soldiers and the Japanese women, were completely still now, watching this clash of worldviews play out. Mrs. Fletcher found her voice. But Lieutenant Colonel, surely you see the danger in this? If we show weakness, if we appear to be friends with the people we just defeated, how do we maintain order? How do we ensure they don't? Weakness. Hartley turned to her, and his eyes held something that looked almost like sadness. Mrs. Fletcher, I've read your articles. Powerful stuff. You've made people back home understand the cost of this war, and that matters. But tell me something. Do you really believe that kindness is weakness? Do you honestly think that showing compassion to civilians, to non-combatants, somehow dishonors the men who suffered? Mrs. Fletcher's pen stopped moving. That's not what because I knew those men, Hartley continued, his voice soft but relentless. I held some of them as they died. And do you know what most of them talked about? Not revenge, not hatred. They talked about home, about their families, about wanting this all to be over, about hoping the world would be different after, better. They didn't die so we could perpetuate cruelty. They died, hoping we'd build something better than what existed before. Pemberton's face was scarlet now, but there was something else in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in the armor. You're being naive, Hartley. The world doesn't work that way. Power is what maintains peace. Respect born from strength, from fear? Hartley asked. Is that what you want, Major? You want these people to fear us? To hate us? Because I promise you, that approach has been tried throughout history and it has never led to lasting peace. It leads to resentment, to rebellion, to the next generation carrying the grudges of this one. Is that the future you're building? A long pause. Somewhere in the ruins, a bird called out, absurdly normal. One of the soldiers coughed. The young Japanese mother had tears streaming down her face now, and even though she couldn't understand the words, she seemed to understand the battle being fought over her dignity. Hartley took a breath and spoke again, this time directly to the heart of their objections. I know we all lost people in this war. I know the Japanese military committed terrible acts. I'm not asking anyone to forget that or to pretend it didn't happen. But these women here, he gestured to the group, they didn't do those things. They didn't start this war. They didn't make those decisions. They're victims of the same madness that took our loved ones. And if we can't see that, if we choose to punish the innocent for the crimes of the guilty, then we're no better than the worst of what we fought against. The words hung in the air like a judgment. Ashford opened his mouth, then closed it. Mrs. Fletcher stared at her notebook. And Pemberton, Major Geoffrey Pemberton, who'd built his entire worldview on hierarchy and order, and the clear lines between victor and vanquished, looked for the first time uncertain. Into the heavy silence, something unexpected happened. One of the Japanese women, not the elderly one, not the young mother, but a middle-aged woman with burn scars on her arms and a face that carried the weight of unspeakable loss, took a step forward. Then another. The other women gasped, reaching out as if to pull her back, but she continued walking toward Hartley, her movements slow and deliberate. She stopped 3 feet from him, and her eyes, dark and deep with grief, met his directly. She didn't reach for the food. Instead, she spoke in Japanese, her voice clear despite its trembling. None of the British soldiers understood the words, but they understood the tone. It was a question, layered with years of pain and confusion. An interpreter who'd been hanging back near the trucks quickly stepped forward, translating in a quiet voice. She asks if this is real, if you are really offering help, or if this is a trick to make them feel ashamed. She says her son died fighting in the Philippines. She says her husband was killed in the Tokyo firebombing. She says she was told you would come to punish them, that this was Japan's fate. She says she doesn't understand why you would feed the mother of your enemy. The translation shattered something in the square. Mrs. Fletcher's hand went to her mouth. One of the younger British soldiers turned away, his shoulders shaking. Even Pemberton's rigid posture softened slightly, his military bearing cracking to reveal the grief underneath, the brother he'd lost, the anger that had been protecting him from processing that loss. Hartley looked at the woman for a long moment, then slowly lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself to her eye level. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to every military protocol and occupation dynamic, that several people gasped. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, and he waited for the interpreter to translate each phrase. This is real. This is not a trick. I cannot bring back your son or your husband. I wish I could. I lost men too. Good men. Men with families who love them. War takes and takes, and it leaves all of us with holes that never quite fill. But I can do this one small thing. I can make sure you eat today. And that is not about shame or power or who won or lost. It's just about being human to another human. That's all. Nothing more, but also nothing less. The translation finished, and the woman's face crumbled. She reached out with shaking hands and accepted the box of biscuits, then bowed so deeply her forehead nearly touched the ground. But Hartley gently touched her shoulder, stopping her mid-bow, shaking his head. No, he said softly. Please. You don't bow to me. We're equals here. Just people trying to survive what war did to all of us. As the interpreter translated, something remarkable happened. The woman straightened, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than fear or grief crossed her face. Something like dignity restored. She clutched the box to her chest and stepped back, and immediately the other women surged forward, no longer held back by fear. Other soldiers, seeing Hartley's lead and perhaps shamed by their own hesitation, began distributing more rations. The square transformed from a standoff into something that looked almost like community. Still awkward, still weighted with history, but undeniably human. But then came the first revelation that would completely reframe everything. Pemberton, watching this unfold with a face full of conflicting emotions, finally spoke again, his voice much quieter now, stripped of its earlier authority. Hartley, I don't understand you. After everything you saw in Burma, everything you went through, I read the reports, you know. I know what happened at Kohima. I know you held that position against impossible odds. I know you lost 3/4 of your company. I know. He paused, and when he continued, his voice cracked slightly. I know you were recommended for the Victoria Cross for what you did. You're a bloody war hero, man. You have every right to hate these people. So why this? Why now? A murmur went through the assembled soldiers. Several hadn't known about Hartley's war record. He'd never mentioned it, never wore his decorations casually, never traded on his reputation. Even the Japanese women sensed a shift in the atmosphere as the translator quietly shared what had been said. Hartley stood slowly, his knee aching from old wounds. And when he spoke, his voice carried a story none of them had heard. Kohima, Hartley said, the word seeming to cost him something. Yes, Kohima. We held that ridge for 16 days, Major. 16 days of hell. We were supposed to be overrun in 2. The Japanese forces outnumbered us 5-1, and they were desperate. The whole Burma campaign depended on taking that position. And we held because we had no choice. Men died next to me, Major. Boys, really. Teenagers who'd never left England before the war. I watched them take bullets, bayonet wounds, mortar fire. I held them while they bled out, while they called for their mothers. And yes, the enemy trying to kill us was Japanese soldiers. Brave ones, actually. Committed. They fought with everything they had. He paused, his eyes distant, seeing something the rest of them couldn't. On the 14th day, during a brief ceasefire to collect the dead, something happened that I've never talked about, never written in a report. One of their soldiers, badly wounded, had been left behind when his unit retreated. He couldn't move. He was maybe 19 years old, and he was dying. And do you know what he did when he saw me approaching? He smiled, Major. He smiled and pulled out a photograph, creased and bloody, of his family. A mother, a father, a little sister. And he said something in Japanese I couldn't understand. But I knew what he was saying. He was saying, "This is who I am. Not just a soldier, not just the enemy. This." Then he died. Right there. Still holding that photograph. The square was utterly silent now. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "I took that photograph," Hartley continued, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a worn, folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully, revealing a faded image of a Japanese family standing in front of a house, smiling, frozen in a moment before the war had consumed everything. "I've carried this ever since, as a reminder that every person I saw through my rifle sights, every enemy in our intelligence reports, every name on a casualty list, they all had one of these. Families, lives, people who loved them. And when this war ended, I made a choice. I decided that if I survived, I would never forget that the enemy is just another word for someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father. That's why I'm doing this, Major. Not despite Kohima, but because of it." But there was more. Mrs. Fletcher, her journalist's instinct fighting with her shifting worldview, found her voice again. That's very moving, Lieutenant Colonel. Truly. But you have to understand, the people back home, they need to know that justice is being served, that the suffering wasn't for nothing, that— "Mrs. Fletcher," Hartley interrupted, and now his voice carried something new. Not anger, but a profound sadness mixed with an uncomfortable truth. "I know your readers need that. I know you've built your career on giving them a clear enemy, a clear villain. But let me tell you something else about my time in Burma. Something that might not fit neatly into your articles." He walked slowly toward her, his movements deliberate. "In the prisoner of war camps, yes, British soldiers were treated terribly, horrifically, and those responsible should answer for those crimes. But there were also Japanese soldiers who shared their own meager rations with prisoners, who risked punishment to get them medicine. I know because I met some of those prisoners when we liberated the camps, and they told me. They told me about the soldier who smuggled them rice, about the guard who warned them before inspections, about the medic who treated their wounds even though it was forbidden. These stories don't fit your narrative, do they? They're complicated, messy. They show that even in the worst circumstances, even on the enemy side, there were humans being human." Mrs. Fletcher's face had gone pale. I never heard those stories." "Because no one wants to hear them," Hartley said gently. "Because they complicate the hatred. But here's what I've learned. Mrs. Fletcher, if we only tell one kind of story, if we only see people as monsters or heroes, as winners or losers, as us or them, we guarantee the next war. We guarantee that in 20 years, maybe 30, someone else's son will die on some other battlefield, because we couldn't find the courage to see the humanity in people who don't look like us, or speak like us, or fight for the same flag." He turned back to Pemberton, and his voice grew even softer. "Major, you lost your brother at Singapore. I know. And I'm sorry. Genuinely, deeply sorry. But let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. If your brother could speak to you now, would he want his death to fuel endless cycles of revenge? Or would he want his death to mean something? To build toward a world where someone else's brother doesn't have to die in the next war?" Pemberton's face crumbled. The mask of military authority, the rigid certainty, the anger he'd been using as armor against grief, all of it fell away. And what was left was just a man who'd lost someone he loved. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I don't know. God help me, I don't know. I'm so angry. I'm so tired of being angry.